Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Ceramic Storytime with Sue. I'm Sue McLeod, and today I'm going to be reading you one of my blog posts. It's called Getting Clarity with Clear Glazes. So I'm just going to make sure I'm live. Every week is an adventure with technology. Okay, looks good. So if you're here with me live, please say hello in the comment section if you can. I've heard some people are have been having trouble like even being able to make comments on the Facebook Live. So let me know if you can see and hear me. And if you want me to see your comments, because I'm using this software called Be Live, you have to give them permission for them to show me your name, for Facebook to show me your name. So there is a link. Let me just copy and paste it here. And I'm going to paste it in the comments. And if you just click this link, then it just gives permission to the software for me to see your name. So if you're commenting, then I can tell who's saying what. So Joan, good morning, Joan. Nice to see you. Awesome. Okay, so if you're just joining me, this is Ceramic Storytime with Sue, and I'm going to be reading my blog post called Getting Clarity with Clear Glazes. And if you want to follow along, if you go to bit.ly/Clear Glazes, then that will take you to my blog post. And that is the link that's scrolling across the bottom of the screen. And then I'm going to share my screen. Hello, Sheila from Kingston. Welcome. So glad to have you here. It's your first time with me today. Awesome. Okay, so I'm just going to tidy up my screen here. I'm going to hide that. And then, so this is the blog post, Getting Clarity with Clear Glazes, that I'm going to read for you. So feel free to follow along. And you can also download it as a PDF if you click this link. Then you enter your email address and then I will send that to you. So as I'm reading, feel free to ask questions, type in your comments, and then I'm happy to respond as we go along. Let me just fix my screen a bit here. Okay. Hello from Istanbul. Oh, Tolga from Istanbul. Wonderful. And Paul is here. Great. So I'm just looking at Facebook right now, but if too many comments come through, then I can actually go back and read past comments, and so I won't be able to see your names. Okay, just my screen. I just need to make my screen a bit bigger. Okay. So getting clarity with clear glazes. There's nothing worse than a cloudy clear glaze muddying up your beautiful slip design, screen printed images, or colored clay. How can we make sure our clear glaze is always clear and prevent it from going cloudy? In this article, I'll explain some of the factors that affect the transparency of a glaze and an easy solution to a common cause of cloudy clears. Transparency, translucency, and opacity. Glazes have varying levels of transparency, translucency, and opacity. Transparency and opacity are opposites, and then translucency falls in between. Transparent means all light can pass through and we can clearly see what's on the other side, like a clear glass window. Translucent means some light can pass through, but we can't clearly see what's on the other side, like sheer curtains or a frosted glass window. And then opaque means no light can pass through, and we can't see what's on the other side, like heavy drapes or a boarded up window. So clay can be translucent or opaque, but clay can't be transparent. So you can have translucent porcelain, and then and that allows the light to pass through. Most clay is quite opaque, meaning that light doesn't pass through. And then clay can't be transparent. Glazes can be transparent, translucent, or opaque. They can also have varying degrees of transparency and opacity. Clear glazes can be transparent and translucent, but a clear glaze can't be opaque by definition. And then white and colored glossy glazes, they can be transparent, translucent, or opaque, whereas matte glazes can only be translucent or opaque. So a matte glaze can be translucent where you can sort of see through and what's on the other side. It's not going to be a clear image. But a matte glaze can't be transparent, meaning all the light can pass through by definition. And that's because a matte glaze is crystals growing in a glass, which means all those teeny tiny crystals that form in the glass of a matte glaze are actually blocking the light. So a matte glaze can't be transparent. So here's a little chart just to lay out what I explained above. Pretty straightforward, but just in case you weren't clear on the difference between transparency and translucency, etc. So the best clear glazes are completely transparent and clearly show the clay and designs underneath. The transparency of a glaze can be reduced when it contains particles that block light from passing through. The more light blocking particles in a glaze, the less transparent it will be. So, reasons why your clear glaze isn't completely clear. If your clear glaze isn't all that clear, here are a few common reasons why. Number one, it could be underfired. And I'm going to go through each of these and kind of explain a little bit more. So your clear glaze might not be clear because it's underfired. It might not be clear because of the chemistry of the recipe. And so that clear glaze recipe, based on the chemistry, just isn't going to be that clear. And then number three, it could be that your application is too thick. And glaze application thickness is the easiest of these three issues to test and solve. And I will explain how in this article. So first, I'll talk about number one and number two, because reducing your glaze application thickness won't make a difference if the issue is due to underfiring or due to chemistry. So let's talk about if your clear glaze is underfired. An underfired glaze is a glaze that has not completely melted yet. Glazes are made of powdered materials that melt in the kiln. The powdered materials start out completely opaque in their powdered form. So when you glaze your pieces, you get that layer of powdered glaze on, on your bisqueware. And so that's completely opaque. They're just powdered particles stuck to your clay. Then as the temperature increases during the firing, those powders melt and dissolve into glass. If your glaze isn't completely melted, then those unmelted particles are going to block the amount of light that can pass through. Small differences in firing temperature can impact glaze results. If the clarity of your clear glaze varies depending on placement in the kiln, it's possible that your kiln has hot and cool spots that are affecting your glaze. The first step is to figure out if your kiln's underfiring by using witness cones. And there's a link here to an article that I wrote about the importance of using witness cones, if you want to check that out. I recommend putting witness cones in multiple places throughout your kiln so you can see if there's any variation of temperature throughout. If your kiln's underfiring, you'll want to increase your firing temperature. Underfiring isn't good for your clay or your glazes. Be careful that you don't increase your firing temperature too much so that it's overfiring. Overfiring can have a negative impact on your other glazes, causing them to run, or on your clay body, which can cause bloating. I always fire to the temperature that's best for my clay body, and then I'm making sure that I'm using glazes that also work at that temperature. So I always choose my temperature based on my clay body, not based on the glazes that I want to use, because you want to make sure that your clay body is properly vitrified. And then you find glazes that match your clay body at that temperature. You don't want to change your whole firing or just one glaze, you don't want to change your whole firing for just one glaze because it will affect so many other things. It's much simpler to change the glaze. If your witness cones tell you that your kiln's firing to the right temperature for your clay and glazes, then you can rule out temperature as the issue and focus on the glaze itself. So if you test your kiln, you put cones in your firings and you know that your kiln is not under firing, but your clear glazes aren't turning out that clear, then you can rule out under firing as a cause for your cloudy clear glazes. So reason number 2 is your clear glaze isn't clear because of the chemistry. Glossy glazes without any colorant or opacifier in them can range from clear to white. In other words, they range in opacity and transparency. The appearance of any particular glaze is based on its chemistry. So this photo shows a bunch of glaze tests that I did where the only differences between them are the silica and alumina levels. And if you're familiar with the stall chart, this is basically, I mapped out the stall chart. So each of these test tiles is a point on the stall graph. And these were all fired to cone 6. So for those of you who understand the UMF and stall, these tiles are my recreation of the stall chart at cone 6. Silica increases from left to right. So across the rows, as you go from left to right, the amount of silica is increasing, and that's the only variable that changes as you move from left to right across the x-axis. And then alumina increases along the y-axis from bottom to top. So as you move from down here to up here, the level of alumina increases. If you're going straight up, then nothing else changes, only the alumina level increases. The flux ratio for all of these test tiles, stay with me if you're not sure what I'm talking about, but the flux ratio, so it's the ratio of primary flux to secondary flux. So in this case, my primary flux is sodium. Na2O stands for sodium. My secondary flux is calcium. So the flux ratio for all of these test tiles is constant at 0.3 to 0.7. And then the boron level, B2O3, stands for boron, is also constant for all these test tiles, and it's at 0.15. So everything is constant with all of these glaze tests aside from the silica and the alumina. So what I'm trying to show you here is that you can see that there is a range of clarity with all of these base glazes. So there's no opacifiers, there's no colorants or anything in these glazes. And so you can see the color of the clay body. Hopefully you can see my arrow. So these glazes in the center here are the most clear and transparent. You can see that the glaze kind of matches the color of the clay body, and so those are the clearest glazes. And then as you go to the left and to the right, they kind of get more white. So this just shows that like a base glaze without any colorants or opacifiers can range in transparency and translucency, and it can be anywhere from clear to white. Please, if you have questions, type them in the comments because I'm happy to answer any questions. So these glaze tests don't contain any colorants or opacifiers. They're all made from the same ingredients, and they're all chemically identical in every way except for 2 factors, the silica and the alumina. These test tiles are arranged in a specific way, which I already explained this, but I'll explain it again. Moving from left to right across each row, each tile has small additions of silica. And the first glaze on the left of each row has slightly more EPK than the glaze in the row below it. So EPK, which is Edgar Plastic Kaolin, which is our main source of alumina in a glaze recipe, or not our main source, but it is a source of alumina. And so the first tile on each row has a little bit more EPK than the row below it. So alumina increases as you go up, silica increases as you go to the right. Sheila asks, would all of those tests be completely vitrified? So the clay body is vitrified, and vitrified is the opposite of porous. So our bisque is very porous, meaning it has little networks of pores, pathways of air going through all the clay particles at the bisque stage. And then as our bisque is fired to its maturing temperature, the silica in the clay body itself melts and turns to glass and fills in all those pores, which makes the clay vitrified. So for glazes, we wouldn't really refer to them as vitrified. We would refer to them as properly melted, perhaps. So no. So all of these glazes on the bottom row, you can see there's some dripping. So these are all possibly overfired, I would say, where they've started running. And on the top row, where the alumina level is really high, these are all underfired. And as you can see, they're all white, kind of. They have a whitish tone across the top, meaning these ones haven't completely melted. These ones are kind of over melted down here. These ones over here have excess amounts of silica, so these are also overfired. And so, yeah, so they're not, because the chemistry of each of these test tiles is a little bit different, they're all going to melt and mature at different temperatures. Claire says, how do you determine if the glaze you are formulating is a cone 04 or cone 6? Can the UMF help me determine that? And if so, how do I do that? Oh, sorry, there's something blocking my screen here. If so, how do I do that? Is there a good book out there that can help me better understand? Yeah, so you can, I mean, the more you study the UMF, the unity molecular formula, the more you can kind of take a guess at whether a glaze is going to be for cone 04, cone 6, or cone 10. A lot of that is based on the boron level of the glaze, but there's so many factors that can affect what temperature a glaze is going to melt at. So I would say, like, by studying the UMF, the more you study it, the more patterns you're going to see, and maybe be able to guess at the a firing range for a glaze. But you can never really know for sure until you've fired a test with that chemistry or with a similar chemistry. Good books out there. Let me see. So there's Clay and Glazes for the Potter by Daniel Rhodes, which I'm not sure. I'm sure he must go into the UMF and understanding it. There is Val Cushing's handbook that talks about chemistry. There are a few books out there. I'm planning on doing some blogging about chemistry coming up in the near future. And so I'd love to explain this further. But it's quite a big subject. Like, I took courses at Alfred University with Matt Katz, and that's kind of where I learned all of this. And then I did tons and tons of testing where I was able to verify what I was learning, and then kind of really understand how everything works. So that's an option if you want to take classes with Matt Katz. That is where I learned all of this chemistry and the unity molecular formula. So let's see here. I won't get into too much chemistry in this article because there's a lot that would need to be explained to fully understand the differences between all of these test tiles. If you'd like to read how I created these tests and the chemistry behind them, you can check out my NCECA 2018 presentation called Understanding Cone 6. So there's a link here if you're on the article, which is at bit.ly/Clear Glazes, then this link will take you to my NCECA presentation where I explain, so this was like a research project that I did for that NCECA presentation. And so I explain how I created all of these tests and kind of my decision-making process. And then I also analyze the results and kind of explain how the chemistry affects the results. So there's another thing that you could read. There's a video, or you can read it as in a blog post as well. So the reason I'm showing this to you is so you can see the small window of really clear glazes that exist within all of these glaze possibilities. So all of these glazes have the exact same materials, ingredients in them, but the chemistry is slightly different. And so there's this little window here where the glazes are actually quite clear. And then the rest is where they're kind of cloudy or opaque or matte or underfired, that sort of thing. So as you can see, there's a wide range of whiteness versus clearness, meaning opacity versus transparency. Some are matte, some are glossy, some are running, some are underfired, some are crazed. So the clearest glazes fall on the second row from the bottom. So the second row from the bottom here. So all of these glazes by UMF have 0.4 moles of alumina. And so here is that second row. And then, so these two glazes here are the clearest of this row. The rest of them are kind of white, even if only slightly. And so we want a clear, transparent glaze. You know, especially like if we're using a colored clay body, or if we're using underglazes or colored slips, we want our clear glaze to be as clear as possible. So out of 50 different base recipes, all fired to cone 6, only 2 truly clear glazes. The rest have some degree of whiteness to them. My point is, formulating a truly clear glaze isn't all that easy, because a clear glaze can be just a few grams of material away from being white and milky. Because of this, it's really important that you're weighing out your materials accurately when you're mixing your clear glaze. Make sure you're using a good scale and weigh each material carefully. If you do find a great clear glaze recipe that fits your clay body, hang on to it and use the steps in part 3 below to make sure that your results are always as clear as can be. If your clear glaze isn't quite clear and you determine the issue isn't temperature or glaze thickness, that we're going to talk about below, and you're weighing your materials accurately, then your issue could be the chemistry of that glaze recipe. It's possible that it's just not a very clear glaze to begin with. And so then you might want to just find a new clear glaze to try. So it may have been clear enough for the person who created it. Maybe they were glazing porcelain and you couldn't see the milkiness or the cloudiness. So if you're using a white clay body and then your clear glaze has a bit of whiteness to it, you might not realize that it's not actually that clear until you put it on a dark clay body, and then you're like, ah. So if it's not enhancing your pieces, then you'd be doing yourself a favor to move on and find a new one. Chemistry is chemistry, and unless you know how to manipulate the chemistry to fix it, it's probably not going to get much clearer. To find a new clear glaze, you can search glazy.org for a clear glaze at your firing temperature, or you can try posting in this Facebook group to see if anyone can recommend something for your clay body. Okay, so number 3, reason why your clear glaze isn't that clear could be because it's too thick. So some glazes are very clear if they're thin enough, but they go cloudy when they're thick. So this is our Studio Clear Glaze. There's a link to the recipe on Glazy if you want that. And it's applied very thickly over Plainsman M390, which is a dark clay body. A super transparent glaze can still contain tiny light blocking bubbles or particles throughout the glass, but when you have a thin layer, there are so few of them that they aren't visible to the eye, and the glaze can appear completely transparent. If the thickness of the glaze increases, those teeny tiny particles also increase and eventually start to cloud up the glaze. So here are some squiggles to illustrate what I mean. So this, in this first one, say this is your clear glaze, and there are little tiny microscopic little specks and flecks in the glaze. And when your glaze thickness isn't that thick, then you don't even notice them. It looks completely transparent, no problem. And then as your thickness increases, then those teeny tiny little specks, light blocking particles, are going to increase. And eventually, if your glaze is thick enough, they'll kind of take over and cloud the entire surface of your clear glaze. So imagine that these squiggles are tiny light blocking bubbles or particles. In a thin layer, they're spaced out and don't really impede the ability of light to pass through. But as you add more layers, more particles fill in the spaces, and the glaze layer becomes hazy, milky, or cloudy as shown. So these pots here are glazed with the Studio Clear Glaze. This exact same clear glaze is used on these mugs here. So the mugs were made by Margaret Hanson, and they're lovely. So they have a thin layer of clear glaze on them. This bowl here has a thick layer of the same clear glaze. And so this bowl has a blue slip and then these black slip birdies on there. And then the clear glaze was so thick that you can't really see those birds through the thickness of the glaze. So exact same glaze, different thicknesses, different results. When I see good, clear results, sometimes, but not all the time, I know that the issue is not with the clear glaze itself. The issue is with the application thickness. And the best way to control application thickness is by measuring and maintaining the glaze's specific gravity. So I did some tests to figure out our clear glaze's optimal specific gravity. I used a dark stoneware so the clouding is more obvious. So these are all Plainsman M390. And you can see, so this is very thick, this is medium, and then this is the clearest, the thinnest layer, which is more clear and transparent. It's still a little cloudy, so this might not be the clear glaze for you if you're using a dark clay body, but this just shows how clear it can be when it's thin versus how cloudy it can be when it's thick. So all of these tiles were dipped for 6 seconds, and the difference between them is their specific gravity, which means their water content. So the tile on the left has the thinnest glaze layer, and the specific gravity is 1.4 grams per milliliter. And so this one has the most amount of water. This one, specific gravity is 1.5. So as specific gravity goes up, it has less water. Sorry, I should change that. So 1.5, it actually has less water than 1.4. And then the tile on the right is the thickest glaze layer. It has the least amount of water. The specific gravity is 1.6. I got to fix that typo there. See how the glaze clouds up with an increase in specific gravity and a decrease in water content. So I admit that this isn't the clearest glaze out there, and a dark clay body will always enhance a clear glaze's imperfections. But it works pretty darn well, and it doesn't craze on most of the clay bodies that we offer at the studio where I work. So we use Plainsman M340, M370, and M390. So we're happy with it. The way to get the best results with this particular clear glaze is to keep the specific gravity around 1.4 grams per milliliter. And remember that these tiles were dipped for 6 seconds each, which is longer than I would normally dip my pots. Holding a piece in the glaze for less than 6 seconds will give an even thinner layer. The reason I hold test tiles in for longer than my pots is because small test tiles will generally absorb less glaze than a large piece of bisque. I would rather see a thicker glaze layer on a test tile, knowing that it's going to be a closer representation of the results on a larger piece. And since this is a studio glaze where lots of beginners are glazing, the glaze results tend to naturally be on the thicker side. When you're first learning to glaze, it's harder to dip really fast and not make a big mess. So there's definitely an art to it. If your clear glaze goes cloudy when it's thick, follow the steps below to determine the best water content for your glaze and keep it at its optimal level. Just checking the comments here. Hi, bit late. Who's that? Oh, Gemma. Awesome. Good to see you. And then Susan says, hi, Sue. I use your Sue's Clear as my go-to. So that's this glaze here. It's called Sue's Clear on Glazy. It's so good and reliable on my white clay, but of course it's cloudy over dark clay. So I'm on the lookout for a clear that will be good for dark clay. Always hopeful. Yeah, so if anyone in here has an awesome clear glaze that looks good on a dark clay body, please share it with the rest of us. That would be amazing. Elif says, hi, hello. Okay, so how to use specific gravity to improve your clear glaze results. Measuring and maintaining specific gravity is the easiest way to make sure your glaze results are always consistent. When your glaze always has the same ratio of water to solids, then your application will be consistent as well. So how do you measure and adjust specific gravity? So if you click here, if you're on the article and you click here, that will take you to a video of me measuring specific gravity to show you how to do it. And then I also have a free PDF guide that you can download if you go to SueMcLeodCeramics.com/SG guide. And SG stands for specific gravity. So SG guide. Let me just type that in the comments here. Just so you can grab that if you don't have it. So SueMcLeodCeramics.com/SG guide. So I just put that in the comments so you can grab that if you like. So once you're familiar with the steps for measuring specific gravity, here's what to do with your clear glaze. Measure the specific gravity as it is right now without changing anything. Because you want to see what the specific gravity has been as you've been using it. So if you're new to measuring specific gravity, it's good to kind of test your glazes as they are, as you've been using them, to see what the specific gravity is, and then you can make adjustments based on that information. So measure the specific gravity, dip a test tile, and then record the specific gravity on the tile. You may want to paint some underglaze on your tile so you can really see how clear your glaze is, especially if you're using a white clay body. So I always recommend when you're making test tiles to test a glaze for your for your work. If you put images or use underglazes or colored slips or anything on your work, then you should also do that on your test tiles so that you get an accurate representation from the test tile of how that glaze would look on your pots. So then, what is your specific gravity? If it's higher than 1.4 grams per milliliter, then continue with the steps below. If it's at 1.4 grams per milliliter or less, then your glaze already has plenty of water in it, and I wouldn't add any more. 1.4 is the lowest that I keep the specific gravity for regular glazes. Some special effect glazes need a lower specific gravity, and that's usually because they have really high clay content or Gersley borate, or magnesium carbonate. So those are materials that are very absorbent, and so they require a little bit more water, which would give you a lower specific gravity. So, but 1.4 for most glazes, 1.4 is about the minimum that I would be keeping it. So if your glaze is already at 1.4 or below, then I would say that it has plenty of water in it and I wouldn't add any more. So, important. If it's your first time adjusting specific gravity, I recommend mixing a small test batch or removing a small sample of your glaze from the main bucket to experiment with. I don't want you to mess with a large bucket of glaze in case you don't like the results. So, step 3, if your specific gravity is higher than 1.4, then add a very small amount of water to your glaze. Always start small until you're comfortable with how much water it takes to reduce the specific gravity by a certain amount. So say you measure your specific gravity of your clear glaze as it is right now, and it's 1.6. Then I would add a little tiny bit of water, mix your glaze well, and then measure specific gravity again. And then you're going to kind of see like, okay, I added like this much water and it lowered it by a few points, or it lowered it a lot, depending on the test batch that you're working with. And then you can use that information to continue to lower your specific gravity. And you want to dip a test tile every time you measure specific gravity and then write the specific gravity on the tile. And I do recommend dipping your test tiles for a consistent amount of time. So choose a number. I choose 6 seconds. So when I'm dipping a test tile, I always dip for 6 seconds. And then I know that the glaze thickness, the difference in thickness isn't based on how long I held the test tile in the glaze for. It can only be based on the amount of water in the glaze. Okay, so after you've added a little bit of water, measured specific gravity again, if it's still above 1.4, repeat the steps above, dipping a test tile with each adjustment as you bring your specific gravity down to 1.4. Then fire all your test tiles and you'll see how glaze thickness and specific gravity will affect your clear glaze. Pick your favorite and then adjust your main bucket of clear glaze to match. I generally use the highest specific gravity that gives me the effect that I want. So if your glaze is crystal clear at 1.45 and 1.4, I would go with the 1.45 as your target specific gravity for that glaze. And that's just because too much water in a glaze can lead to application issues. Your bisque can become saturated with water faster, and then which can cause problems if you're layering glazes. So I try to keep the water to a minimum for whatever the best result that I can get with the least amount of water is basically like my guideline for that. Also important, your glaze sample might become really thin and watery while performing these tests. If that's the case, you may need to flocculate your glaze with a saturated Epsom salt solution. This will thicken your glaze back up again for better application. A thin glaze in the bucket doesn't always mean it has too much water. For info and videos about flocculation, join my free Facebook group, which you guys are all in. So if you want more info about flocculation, if you go to the unit section of this group, then there is actually a section of different posts about flocculation. And then on my website, I also have a blog post, how to make a saturated Epsom salt solution. So if you're wondering how to do that, then you can find that there. And in this Facebook group, in the unit section, there are also links to all of my blog posts. So everything's all nicely organized so you can find it. Once you've determined the best specific gravity for your clear glaze, write it on your glaze bucket and your glaze recipe, and be sure to keep your specific gravity at that number. I recommend measuring specific gravity on a regular basis so you're always going to have the best results. Since water naturally evaporates, it's common for your specific gravity to increase if you haven't glazed in a while. I measure the specific gravity every time I glaze my pots, which isn't all that often. If you're glazing all the time, then I would measure specific gravity every couple of weeks, and especially every time you mix a new batch of glaze. So at Cedar Hill, where I work, we measure the specific gravity of every glaze every month. So because the glazes are all getting used every day, we just have a monthly system where we're measuring specific gravity and making sure it's at our target every month. If none of your test results are an improvement on your Clear Glaze, then you may need to find a new recipe. You're welcome to try my Clear Glaze recipe, which you can find on glazy.org. It's called Sue's Clear, and then it'll have Cedar Hill in brackets. Or you could make a post in this group and see if anyone has one that they'd be willing to share. So that is the end of this blog post. So if anyone has any questions now, I would be happy to answer them. Please just type them in the comment section. And then if you have a Clear Glaze recipe that you've been working with and maybe struggling with, feel free to post it to the group. And you can tag me if you want me to have a look at it. If you post the recipe, if you upload the recipe to glazy.org and then just post a link, then myself and other people in the group that are familiar with the UMF could actually have a look at the chemistry and just see like if it is glaringly obvious that the issue would be with the chemistry of that glaze. So if your Clear Glaze isn't that clear and then you post the recipe and you're firing to cone 6, but it looks like it might be a cone 10 recipe, then it might be that your glaze is actually underfired, that sort of thing. So just checking the comments here. Karen, hi Karen, so good to see you. So Karen is looking for a Clear Glaze if anyone has one to share. Angela says all glazes have the same specific gravity. No, so specific gravity is basically something that you get to decide. And I recommend doing a series of tests as I've explained in this blog post. You can do this with all of your glazes, not just your Clear Glazes, by measuring specific gravity as your glaze is right now, and then incrementally adding water to bring the specific gravity down, dip a test tile at every measurement, and then write that on the test tile. And then if you fire all of those results, then you can pick your favorite and then you'll have the specific gravity value. So then you can make sure that your glaze bucket is always at that same number. So there is no, all glazes should be at 1.5 or 1.4. It's always subjective, and it's based on, like, some glazes are a different color when they're thin versus thick. Other glazes are super runny when they're too thick. So you need to keep the specific gravity down so that they won't run. So it's very much up to you how, and based on testing to determine the best specific gravity for your glaze. Sheila says, why might a Clear Glaze appear to fit the clay body, but sometimes craze a year later and sometimes not on pots just sitting around? I've been checking specific gravity and I will definitely start doing that. So crazing is a completely different topic. It's a mismatch of thermal expansion between the glaze and the clay body. So it's possible that the thickness of your glaze application so if you have a glaze that is really close to fitting your clay body, but doesn't quite fit, it's possible that the crazing won't show up until a bunch of time has passed. So it's kind of a gradual process. If there's a big mismatch of thermal expansion, so your glaze has high expansion, your clay body has low expansion, then your glaze is likely to just be crazed coming out of the kiln. Some glazes aren't crazed when you unload them from the kiln, but then over the next couple of days, you hear the little pinging noises, and that is the sound of your glaze crazing. But for some glazes where the thermal expansion is so close, where it actually takes a lot more time for the glaze to craze. And so oftentimes you can have a glaze where the thermal expansion, like where the glaze fits, or it almost fits the clay body, where a very thin layer of glaze isn't going to craze, but if the application thickness is much thicker, then the crazing will show up. So that can also be a factor that can determine like why a certain glaze on a specific clay body might craze sometimes, but not other times. And it's usually because it's just very close to being a good fit. Sometimes a glaze will craze on a clay that's underfired. So if your clay body is underfired, then that can lead to crazing. Because an underfired clay body, basically thermal expansion changes as temperature changes. So the thermal expansion of an underfired clay body is going to be different, lower probably than the thermal expansion of a properly vitrified clay body. So all of these factors can kind of affect whether a glaze would craze or not. Claire says, a low fire clear I've been fiddling with is Deb's Clear, and you should be able to get a copy on Ceramic Arts Network. Yes. Thank you for posting that. So some people might want to try Deb's Clear from Ceramic Arts Network. Okay, Elif says, yes, please. Can friends here post pics with the recipes or post links like Sue, and will be much appreciated. Super new to making glaze. Thank you so much. Happy to have found you and this group. Hi, everyone. Yes, happy to have you here as well. Kon Ong says, how is the range of specific gravity if I want to have a test? So as I was saying earlier, I would just measure the specific gravity of your glaze as it is right now, as you've been using it, and figure out what that specific gravity number is. And then if it's much higher than 1.4, so 1.4 is kind of, I was saying like the minimum, where I don't normally keep glazes below 1.4. So if you measure your specific gravity and it's at 1.6, then you could add a bit of water to bring it down, maybe test it at 1.55, 1.5, 1.45. And then you fire all those tests and you see the results, and then you decide what you want your specific gravity to be. And Cone, I know you're in my upcoming Mastering Glaze Consistency class. So we're going to get into all of that very soon. Claire says, is pinholing a cause of a glaze being applied too thick? There are so many different causes for pinholing, different types of pinholes, different reasons why a glaze would pinhole. It could be because the glaze is too thick. Generally, that's not what I've noticed. Some glazes will have pinholes if they're over-fired. So as the glaze starts running, little bubbles that may have stayed inside the glaze, as the glaze runs, it exposes those little bubbles. And then other glaze, it's because of the colorants off-gassing. Sometimes it's blistering and not pinholing. So pinholing is a big subject. I haven't personally like solved for pinholing yet, because I've just found like that there's so many different types of pinholes and reasons. So if you have a pinholing issue, I recommend posting a photograph of your pinholes to the Facebook group, and then also post the recipe of that glaze. And then myself and others in the group can help you troubleshoot that. Awesome. So forgot about Deb's Clear. Yes. Okay. So if there are any more questions, comments, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, yeah, please post in the Facebook group, post your clear glaze recipes, and let's see if we can figure out how to have the clearest clear glazes out there. So thank you all for joining me here today, and I will let you go, and I will see you next week for another story time. Okay, bye.